To double pointed needles is not as complicated as it might seem. So for this example, I am just going to be doing a basic long tail cast on, but you can do whichever cast on you prefer. So I'm going to start by making the loop, and then I'm going to grab, I have my double pointed needle set here, I'm going to grab my first one and I'm going to put that on the needle. So different projects will tell you how to arrange the needles. Sometimes they'll want you to have them evenly spread. For this example, I'm going to be casting on 20 stitches onto the first needle and then 10 stitches onto onto each of the other two needles. So I'll start casting on 1, 2, and now I'm going to do 10 onto the next needle. So I'm going to continue casting on like I normally would. I just kind of let this hang to the side. The first one can be a little tricky. You cast on like you normally would, whatever cast on you're doing. So now you can see that the first one is hanging here and the other needle is hanging off. So then I will just continue casting onto that needle from there. 20 stitches on my first needle, 10 on the next needle, and now I'm going to do the same thing. I'm kind of going to just let them hang, and it looks really weird and confusing, but don't worry too much about it. So I'm going to cast onto that next needle, and I'm going to count to 10. Have all these stitches onto the needles like I want them, 20, 10, and 10. Next thing I'm going to do is to start knitting. So you want to make sure that, same as with circular needles, that they don't get twisted, and it sort of aligns itself sometimes if the needles get like twisted like this. You just have to make sure that you have the first needle that you cast it onto on the left, then the second needle, and then you will take the third needle and put it up like this. And I try to keep them kind of in the middle, and it doesn't matter which needle is overlapping which needle. It kind of just depends from person to person what they prefer, and once you start knitting, you'll sort of get the hang of what flows the best for you. So I'm going to double check that I'm casting onto the yarn that is attached to the ball and not to the tail. I do this a million times where I cast on and I start knitting with the tail, and then I have to start all over again. So what I'm going to do is that first stitch that you casted on, where I'm going to start knitting, to the left of the stitch that has the yarn attached to it. And this is where your next needle is going to come into play. So since I have 3 around, I'll need 4 needles total. If you have 4 around, you'll need 5 needles total. So what I am going to do is I'm going to take that first needle that we casted onto, and I'm going to push it to the top of the needle. I'm going to bring the extra needle that I'm knitting with, and I'm going to knit that first stitch, and I'm going to try and pull it as tight as possible. Then I'm just going to continue knitting onto that next needle. One thing that is important to note too is that the first row, or I guess the first few rows, are going to be trickier than the rest of the row. So don't let it discourage you if you struggle a little bit at first. Not only will it be easier, but you will also get the hang of it. I think for me personally, the first few rows are always frustrating, especially because they're really tight, so they're a little slower to knit than other rows. And sometimes a pattern also will tell you to start doing, knit purl or whatever brim right away. I like to do a knit row first just to get things moving. I find that it makes it a lot easier to knit. So sometimes you have to slide your yarn back a little bit. I'm going to keep knitting. And now I'm doing the last stitch. So once I have that last stitch, I'm going to remove the extra needle, and then I'm going to slide that to the center. I try and keep them as in the center as possible, but it isn't critical. You can do whatever you want. Usually they're pretty tight on there and they're not going to fall off. So now I'm ready to knit the next section. So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to push that needle that I will be knitting off of through the top. I'm going to grab my extra needle, and I'm going to knit through that first stitch. So I'm going to put my stitch through, grab the yarn, and then knit. And sometimes, and this, it takes a little bit of practice, but you want to try and make that first stitch as tight as possible. Sometimes what can happen is if you're knitting loosely, you end up getting sort of stretched stitches in between each needle, and it's not the end of the world, but I know I don't love that look. Even if it does happen, don't worry about it. It will sort of fix itself after a few rows once you get knitting. So now I've done the same thing. I have knitted to the end of that needle. I'm going to remove that needle and pull it to the middle. We're now going to knit the last needle, so I will slide it to the top like I've done before, and I will start knitting. The first one is always the trickiest. So I grab it there, sorry if that was a little out of view, and then I continue to knit. Now I'm doing the last stitch in the round, and this is the area where it kind of gets tricky because that spot tends to be the most loose between needles. So the tighter you knit the first and the last stitch, the better. I want to make sure that when I'm going into my next round that I am not knitting with a tail. Yeah, like I mentioned, I do that all the time. So now after doing that first round of knit is when I would start doing the pattern. So you do the same thing. You slide the needle to the top. You start with your knit or purl stitch depending on your pattern, pull it as tight as you can, and then continue on from there. And I would say one of the things with double pointed needles is it takes practice. I know when I first started knitting with them, I found it really discouraging because it didn't look perfect, it didn't look exactly the way I wanted to, but it's one of those things where once you practice, you'll get better. So don't just get discouraged if it's not perfect the first time. And also, once you get past the first few rows, it is going to be a lot easier. What I like to do when I'm knitting is I like to keep the edge of the knitting, so I like to keep that folded toward myself. And so in the first few rows, it can kind of flip-flop and it doesn't really make a difference. And that's why it gets so much easier once you're past a few rows, because that will poke out and it'll, or like pull out toward you, and it'll keep all your needles in place. So you don't have to worry so much about the holes forming. There is also one more option. So in order to tell when you've made it around, the way that I personally do it is I just look at where the tail is, and once I reach the tail, then I know that I've made it to the end. Some people like to place a stitch marker on that row so it's a lot more visible. Oops. So it's up to you whether or not you want to remember because of where the tail is, or if you want to place a stitch marker to remember. So the way that I personally prefer to hold my needles is I like to have this needle coming over the top, so the needle you just knit off of. I like to have the bottom needle positioned under and then over the needle that you're knitting off of. And then when I pull my yarn up, or push my yarn up, sorry, what I like to do is I like to flip this needle so that you are knitting around it. So the needle will be towards you and you knit behind it. For me, that personally works the best, but it really varies from person to person which direction they want it. So I would say just try around or play around with a few different things, see what works for you, see what feels right. And I would say within like 4 or 5 rows that you'll have the hang of it and it'll be a lot smoother.